Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at a best case scenario for the Republican Party in the Senate and governor elections. Now, disclaimer, this is not my actual prediction for the 2022 midterms, but rather it's just what Republicans' ceiling I think would be. And this is best case scenario. So some of these are certainly going to be a stretch. I've done that on purpose. Again, I'm trying to account for a best possible scenario for the Republican Party going into these elections. And in some cases, it only takes moving the polls 3 or 4 points to the right to get some of these pretty surprising results. So we're going to get into all of those in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below, liking this video if you enjoy. Of course, link down below to the election night live stream, 7 p.m. Eastern on November 8th. Be sure to set your reminders for that. With that out of the way, let's get straight into the video. So we're going to start off with the state of Washington. Now, this isn't exactly a state you'd think of as a swing state in the midterm elections, but so far in the Senate race, it's gotten really close to the point where Patty Murray is only up by 3 points on RCP, 6 points in FiveThirtyEight. So if the RCP average was to be taken as accurate in this case, Murray only being up by 3 points is a total disaster in Washington state. Of course, you couple that with really poor numbers in terms of the early vote for Democrats in the Seattle area, it could spell disaster for the Democrats in a best case scenario for the Republican Party. So realistically, as of right now, this is probably a race that leans in favor of the Democrats. Murray could even be likely, honestly. Murray probably wins by 6. But in a best case scenario, Smiley would narrowly pull an upset. Now, this is the biggest stretch of the prediction, so I'm just going to put that up front right there. I don't think this is going to happen, but Tiffany Smiley was an incredible recruit for the Republicans to run. She's very good for the state of Washington. She's been running a much more moderate suburban mom type of campaign, and that certainly plays a lot better in these very blue states. I mean, this is a state that voted for Joe Biden by almost 20 points, 19.2%. This is a really blue state, and yet Murray has managed to make this race close because she's not a strong incumbent, because she's running for a 6th term. She's been in office for a very long time. Voters are tired, and they want change. Moving on down to the state of Nevada. In a best case for Laxalt, I could easily see him winning by about 5 points or so, maybe even more than that. It could even be 6. Nevada is a state that tends to overestimate Republicans in polling support. If we take a look at the polling aggregates for this race, Laxalt is up by 1.2 in RCP. Masto is up narrowly in FiveThirtyEight and 270, which I didn't even know how to polling aggregate. Laxalt is up by 0.2. So ultimately that puts Laxalt in a somewhat precarious position, because if that is the trend in Nevada, he certainly has a lot of work to do. One bright side I will say is that Cortez Masto, her average is only around 46%. If momentum is swinging in the Republicans' direction, where it's very likely to, Laxalt will improve on his 46-47% margin and ultimately come out on top. And Emerson is a polling company that has been very accurate in Nevada in the past, so the fact that it has Laxalt up by 5 really isn't that unrealistic in a best case scenario. Again, Masto's an incumbent, so I think it'll be a bit harder for him to pull off a victory like that. It's certainly not my final prediction, but I think a best case scenario would have Laxalt up by 5. Down in Arizona, I would put this as lean Republican in favor of Blake Masters. Again, if we take a look at the polling aggregate for Kelly, he's been sliding in the polls as of late, and I think the national environment has really dragged him down to the point where Blake Masters is leading in his first poll now. This is also an Emerson poll, which is very interesting because Emerson has Republicans leading in basically all of the key battleground states. Of course, here in Arizona, most of the polls have Kelly up. So it would be rather interesting if Emerson was ahead of the ball game with a lot of these polls. Blake Masters being up by 1 is very realistic, especially when you consider a final margin. But taking a look at this Senate race overall, again, Kelly was somebody who won only by 2.4% back in the 2020 election. If we pull up his polling average back then, Kelly was up by about 5 points. So he underperformed by about 3. That looks to be exactly what's on track to happen in this race. He's going to underperform by 3, which means he would lose by about 1 or so, which is what I think will happen realistically. But in a best case, Blake Masters gets a bump from the national environment and ultimately probably wins this by about 2.5 to 3 points. Moving on over to the state of Colorado, Joe O'Dea, I think, was an incredible recruit for the Republican Party in Colorado. He very much fits the state of Colorado. He's more of a social moderate, very fiscally conservative, very pro-gun. So he does have a very interesting track record when it actually comes to the issues. But taking a look at the race overall, this is a race that Bennett is currently leading by a considerable amount, depending on what aggregate you look at. Of course, RCP has Bennett up by 5. 538 has him up by 9. I definitely don't buy that. I think RCP is much more on the money. This very much could be a race that goes down to the wire. And if Trafalgar has any credibility whatsoever in the state of Colorado, it's definitely a good sign for the O'Day campaign. Now, ultimately, will O'Day pull it off realistically? Obviously, that's to be determined. I'll leave that up to my final Senate prediction for that. But in terms of a best-case scenario, I think, yes, O'Day probably would narrowly beat Michael Bennet. It would probably be under a point. It would be extremely close, but Bennet is somebody who chronically underperforms his polls. He's not a very strong incumbent, and I think it could come as a surprise to a lot of people. Joe O'Day would probably have a unique appeal in the Denver suburbs, which are very socially liberal, potentially fiscally conservative, but they're really just liberal across the board. So with a turnout differential, it certainly could help. And again, Colorado is a state like Washington where the early vote has not really been good for the Democrats. They're not meeting the metrics that they anticipated. They're much below them, especially in the state of Colorado, which is why many think this race is going to be very close, because we all know that Republicans, by and large, disproportionately vote on election day. So if the Democrats aren't turning out early, could potentially be a bad sign for them going forward. Moving on down to Wisconsin, this would probably be a likely Johnson margin. I could easily see a situation where he wins by 7 or 8 points in a best case. Again, Johnson is somebody who's chronically underestimated in polls. 2016 proved that. He didn't lead in a single poll for up to 3 years until right before the election. Some predictors are making very bullish predictions, having him up by a likely margin. Now, I don't know what they consider likely, but this is definitely going to be the case, I would imagine. But in the best case, I could see him winning by about 7, maybe even 8 points, which again, bit of a stretch, but that's really the point of this video as a whole. Moving on down to Illinois. Now, this is a pretty interesting one because I would move this to likely Democratic just because of the national environment. If Cook County turnout is low, and so far minority turnout across the country is lower than what we would have expected, that's a very good sign for the GOP. Now, of course, downstate Illinois is very Republican. The suburbs are more swingy, but they've been pretty Democratic lately. Tammy Duckworth's opponent is actually a very competent challenger. Of course, she's probably not going to win. In fact, she won't win because this is the state of Illinois. But her message has really been getting through to a lot of conservatives, and I think she's better for suburban voters. Of course, it all depends on turnout. Illinois is notoriously known for low turnout in midterm years. Of course, we famously had that upset in the Illinois governor's race with Bruce Rauner winning in 2014 by a decent margin over an incumbent governor because turnout was extremely low all across the country, but especially in the Chicago area, the suburbs where you had a lot of these suburbs going big to Rauner. And Rauner didn't exactly campaign as a liberal. He campaigned as a pro-life conservative in the state of Illinois because the turnout differential in Illinois in some cases is so drastic because of Cook County, not really turning out in midterm years, that you could have situations where you could have, less of a New England style Republican actually end up winning a statewide race. Now, will this happen this time around? No. But if it does get within 10 points, that would be very interesting. Of course, best case scenario, not my prediction again, but it could happen if the national environment is really that strong for the GOP. Over to the state of Ohio, this would probably be safe in a best case scenario for Republicans. This would probably be a Vance plus 12 victory, which would be pretty surprising, especially since Tim Ryan has been polling very well. But again, we all know Ohio polls, when it comes to any statewide race, really aren't all that accurate. Vance being up by 3, 2, 1. We know that Vance is going to win by a much larger margin than that. Emerson College, I think, probably has a much better methodology because this seems a lot more accurate to what the result will probably end up being. I think Vance would easily win by 12 in a best case. Up to the state of New Hampshire, this would be a flip for the GOP. Don Bolduc would probably pull out a narrow victory up in New Hampshire, but a victory nonetheless. He's been surging in the polls as of late. If we take a look at where he's currently at right now, he's at just under a point in terms of being underwater in RCP. Hassan is only up 0.5. Emerson College, though, interestingly enough, has Hassan up by 4. So that's very interesting, especially since Republicans were favored in a number of the other key states. Emerson doesn't see the same favorability for the Republicans in New Hampshire. Of course, St. Anselm College, which polled previous New Hampshire races, has always been extremely accurate. So they have Bolduc leading, but Emerson is also a very reputable pollster. So it's pretty up in the air. But in the best case, obviously, Bolduc is going to flip this. Wrong page. Next, we go down to the state of Pennsylvania. Now, currently in this race, as of right now, I believe John Fetterman is down. He's down in the RCP average by just 1.1%. He's only up by 0.6 in FiveThirtyEight. That's a total disaster if you're not even above a point in FiveThirtyEight, because FiveThirtyEight's polling average always tends to favor Democrats more than Republicans in a lot of cases. So best case scenario for Dr. Oz would probably be a 3-point margin of victory. Republicans have a very low ceiling in Pennsylvania for a number of reasons. They haven't really gotten through yet to a lot of the white working class voters in northeastern PA. They cracked a lot of it in 2016, but they still fell short in places like Lackawanna County. Monroe County is a little less white working class. There's a significant Asian and Hispanic population there. But Lackawanna, they've still really been unable to crack. And this is an 80% white county. It's a plurality white working class county. This should be an area where, if current trends continued, Republicans would be able to flip, even with the city of Scranton being in it. I don't think that's going to happen. Of course, you have rural Pennsylvania as well. This would, of course, a best case scenario would have rural areas turning out for Oz in better numbers than they turned out for Trump relative. So he would be getting higher margins in these counties. I don't necessarily think that's likely. And of course, Oz would be doing extremely well in the Philadelphia suburbs. Moving on down to North Carolina, we're going to keep this as likely. I don't really think this race is going to change much either way. Bud is going to win by around 6. Maybe in a best case he wins by 7, but North Carolina is not very elastic when it comes to these types of races. Georgia, I think in terms of the Senate race, you'd probably have Herschel Walker get maybe 51% of the vote to Raphael Warnock's 48-ish, maybe even 47. So, that would be a 3 to 4 point margin. Again, very much a stretch, but if Brian Kemp on the gubernatorial level is winning by over, 9-10 points, he's very likely going to drag Herschel Walker to a 3 to 4 point margin of victory. Finally, we go down to Florida. This would be safe Republican in this instance. Moving on over to the governorships. Now, this is a totally different ballgame because these are non-federal races. These are races where the federal issues don't really matter as much. These come down to local issues. And that's one of the reasons why you have some very red states like Louisiana, Kansas having Democratic governors, and you have very blue states like Massachusetts and Maryland having Republican governors. Now, taking a look at the governorship so far, we'll start off with the state of Oregon, as we did going west to east in the former prediction. This would be a Drezen victory, probably of around 4 points or so. She'd overperform. Betsy Johnson would significantly hurt Tina Kotek, even more so than she currently is now. So this would be pretty resounding victory for Drezen if it ended up coming to fruition. Down in Nevada, you would probably have Lombardo winning Clark County in a best case scenario. He would probably win by around 6 points. Again, huge stretch. But again, that's the nature of this video. Moving on down to Arizona. I didn't mean to put New Mexico safe red. Moving on down to Arizona, Kari Lake would probably, in a best case, win by around 5 points. Katie Hobbs really hasn't been a good candidate, I don't think, by any metric. She's not really speaking to media. She's not doing campaign events. And Kari Lake, who I originally thought was at risk of losing this race, even during a red year, because of some of her more extreme rhetoric in some cases, that really hasn't happened. She's proven to be very savvy with the media, with her messaging. She has pivoted on a number of issues, and I think ultimately it's going to pay off. Moving on over to New Mexico. Best case scenario, Ronchetti actually flips this state. Now, do I think it's likely? As of right now, probably not, especially since Ronchetti has sort of lost momentum Michelle Lujan Grisham, though, is only up by around 3.5%. I think this is going to be a close race, but I would put Ronchetti probably losing by 3. Originally, I had Ronchetti flipping this. I was very bullish on Republicans' chances in New Mexico for a while because I thought Ronchetti was a very strong candidate. But it seems, and again, it's not set in stone, but based on the polling, he's not exactly quite there. But in the best case, he overcomes that. He flips the state. Up to Colorado, Polis probably wins by only 9 or 10 points. That would be a pretty big shock, especially since he's polling so far ahead of Heidi Ganahl. So, again, very much a stretch, but it could happen. Over in Kansas, you'd probably see a likely victory for Derek Schmidt. I think a best case would probably see him win by 6 to 7. This was a race that I really didn't think the Democrats could win this time around, given the national environment. But Laura Kelly, according to the polls, is surprisingly resilient, and she seems to be hanging in there. So now it's a question of whether the Republicans will even flip it at all. I even made a video months ago saying that Kansas was basically a guarantee to flip to the Republicans, and that might not be the case this time around. Moving on up to Minnesota, a best case there would probably be a flip. And again, this is, of course, a stretch. This is Minnesota. But Walz is only up in the RCP average by 4.3%. It very much could happen just because of the national environment. I don't think it's likely realistically, but for the sake of this prediction, Jensen pulls a narrow victory. It looks like we're in a situation where Keith Ellison is going to lose re-election and some of the other down-ballot Democrats. But in this case, all of the statewide offices would probably flip in that instance. Moving on over to Wisconsin, I think a best case for Michaels is probably a 5-point victory, just based on the national environment. Not exactly likely, but again, we're talking red tsunami. We're talking about a generic ballot that's R+6 or something with the current trends on top of it. Down in Illinois, same thing, likely Democratic. I think a best case scenario for the GOP is maybe only losing this race by 8. Pritzker's not terribly popular, especially in downstate and even parts of Chicago now due to the crime wave. He's up massively in the polls. This is a state, like with the Senate race, that I think a lot of times Republicans are underestimated because of the turnout differential in the Chicago area. Downstate turning out very big. That would probably give Pritzker maybe an 8-point margin of victory. So again, somewhat unrealistic, but again, this is a best case scenario. Of course, best case scenario for the GOP in Michigan is flipping this seat. I think it would be very narrow if it did happen, less than 2 points, obviously. Tudor Dixon's had a number of problems throughout the campaign trail, fundraising, etc. She finally got money and ads in the final weeks of the campaign. Will it be enough? We'll have to see, obviously, but in this case, she pulls out in that instance. Moving on up to Maine, there could potentially be a surprise upset here with Paula Page winning the governor's race. Again, if we take a look at the polling in Maine, which notoriously is not very good, Janet Mills is up 9 points in the aggregate, but some people will point to the Gideon polling that we had back in 2020 where Sarah Gideon was up by 8, and then Susan Collins ended up winning by almost 8 points. So I don't think that's realistic in this race, but there could potentially be a significant polling miss in Maine. Wouldn't be the first time we've seen it. Moving on down to the state of Rhode Island, Ashley Kalus is a pretty good candidate for the state. She's a very good fit for it. Dan McKee is incredibly unpopular. He's also running in a bad year for Democrats, so coupled with that, I mean, he almost lost the primary, his own primary as an incumbent governor. That goes to show you how weak Dan McKee is. Looking at the polls for this race, we've only got 3, but in every single poll, Ashley Kalus has been gaining ground. I don't think this race is realistically a win in a best case scenario. Maybe I'll be proven wrong in a couple of days. But I think a best case scenario with a significant third party share, you could see this race probably go lean Democratic very narrowly. I think McKee would only win by maybe 5. But I don't really see a situation where Kalus actually wins this. It would be very surprising to me if it did. And certainly that wouldn't make this a best case then. But nonetheless, that's probably where I would have that race. Connecticut, same thing. I don't really think it's realistic that Stefanowski wins this time around. He ran a very good race in 2018 against a very unpopular incumbent, or on the coattails, should I say, of a very unpopular incumbent. I think best case for the GOP is they get this in low single digits, but they don't win this race. Moving on up to my home state of New York, this is perhaps the most interesting of all of these races because it really is the big what if. There's three ways the New York governor's race could go. The first one being that the polls are accurate. The RCP average is just about accurate. Kathy Hochul wins by around 6 to 7 points. That's one scenario. There's another scenario where the polls are underestimating Republican support and the turnout differential narrowly carries Zeldin over the finish line or makes it much closer than even the polling suggests. And then finally, of course, there is the scenario in which polls are overestimating Lee Zeldin. Perhaps his polling numbers, his top-line margins in the polls are accurate, but Kathy Hochul is being underestimated. So you could have Zeldin get 44% of the vote, but because there's only two candidates on the ballot, Kathy Hochul would then get 56, which would be a 12-point margin of victory for her. That's a safe Democratic victory. So it is a huge what if. In a best case, though, I would say Zeldin narrowly pulls the upset because New York is a state that tends to have extremely low turnout. But again, this is Republican ceiling. This is the max I could see them doing in this situation. Again, not my prediction. Finally, we go down to Georgia. A Kemp plus 10 victory would probably be a best case scenario for him. In that instance, he'd be winning Cobb County. He'd be very close to winning Gwinnett, and he'd be running it up in the rural parts of the state overall as a pretty strong incumbent, which he has proven to be. He's a very resilient candidate, won the Republican primary with over 70% of the votes, even though Donald Trump made him public enemy number one for a while. Managed to hold on, is now polling ahead of Stacey Abrams in virtually every single poll by a really large amount. In fact, the RCP average now has Kemp up by 8 percentage points. And some analysts in Georgia speculate that this could actually be a double-digit race for Brian Kemp at the end of the day. Some of the polls, I mean, a 14-point margin for Kemp would be absolutely crazy. I don't think it'll happen, but certainly 7 points, 8 points, very much could be on the table for him. I accidentally skipped over Pennsylvania, so we'll get to Pennsylvania now. This would be a very incredible upset if Doug Mastriano managed to win. If you base it off of the polling, Lee Zeldin has a higher chance of winning than Doug Mastriano. Paula Page has a higher chance of winning than Doug Mastriano. Scott Jensen, every single candidate on this board that is not in a safe race has a better chance, besides maybe Bailey and Ganal, has a better chance of winning this race than Doug Mastriano. Now, if we take a look at the polls so far, the RCP average has only gotten worse for Doug over the past couple of days. He's down by 12 points. Even with a 10-point polling miss, he would still lose by 2 points. However, this is still the state of Pennsylvania, and it's very likely that there could be a shy Mastriano voter, a significant undersampling of Western Pennsylvania. If that were to happen and Oz were to win by a larger than expected margin, and maybe Trafalgar's on the money with him only being down in the polls by around 4 points, you could potentially see a Mastriano upset. Now, looking at this map, very, very unrealistic. But this is what I think a best case scenario for the GOP would be. 56 Senate seats and, of course, 36 governorships. Again, not my prediction, but this would be in the instance of a red tsunami. If we saw an R+6, maybe R+7 national environment, a lot of these candidates would be carried over the top. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. Link to the live stream down below on election night, 7 p.m. Eastern on November 8th. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next